Okay, so
Where are we at? How prepared?
you weren't here. You missed the most important section of the whole book.
Told me. Can't do nothing if I can't think.
You know, Warren Wilcox used to say that whenever I missed a class, he would say, well, you missed the most important class of the entire course.
The most important.
So, well, we were dealing with chapter 2, 14 to 26, which really is a very important section of the book. We went through that. I do want to show you something. If you have your Greek text, pull it out, or if you have your logos fired up, I want to walk you back through something that I discovered just this weekend looking back at this section. I've seen it in bits, but I hadn't seen it as completely as I did after I studied through it a little bit more. But a fascinating connection to what we were just talking about in this section of the work. First of all, what was 14 through 26 about?
Faith and works.
Okay, how do we know that?
Because you see it in action.
Okay, you see it in action, and the fact that faith is used 14 times and works is used 13 times. It's kind of hard to miss the context considering he's hammering these two words. If you had to pick a verse out of that section that makes his point, what would you pick?
17.
Okay,
Verse 17.
and what is 17?
So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead.
Okay, there's actually three that I think he uses as summary. 17, so faith without works is dead, being by itself. Verse 20, but are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? And then you have, of course, 26, just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. Those three summary statements, I think, sum up what he's trying to talk about. What kind of faith is the context of this section? What kind of faith is he talking about? How does he start the section? What's he discussing about faith?
Faith works.
The
Faith
saving faith.
Saving faith. Verse 14 is how he sets the tone for this whole discussion on faith and works. Can that faith save him? There's our question. And clearly, with the three summary statements that we see in 17, 20, and 26, his answer is no. That faith cannot save him. And so we're talking about a faith that has the ability to save. The faith that has the power to save. And he says adamantly that that's not the case. Now, he gives 4 illustrations in this section. Charles, what's the first one?
I've got Abraham.
Okay, Abraham's the third one.
Oh.
So Abraham, and who's the other one that's connected, the other illustration that's connected to Abraham? Rahab. So you have Abraham and Rahab that were examples of what?
Of working faith.
Okay, but what's the phrase that he uses to connect both of those illustrations?
Demonstrated.
Okay, they were justified by works, right? Abraham, Luke 21, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac? And then in verse 25, in the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works? So by the time he gets to Abraham and Rahab, he's talking about works that result in justification. What was the first illustration in the section of faith without works is dead?
Giving.
Okay.
Giving to the poor.
Okay, and what was the illustration?
If you don't give him anything, if you just say, go ahead.
Okay, you got a brother or sister that's in, right?
Go in peace.
Right. So you've got this idea of a brother and sister that have no clothing or in need of daily food, and you just tell them, go warm yourself and fill yourself. Now, it is interesting. Again, there's there's some nuances to this that I didn't go through. But if you look at the be warmed and be filled, both of those are middle or passive. The suggestion there is that the person is saying, go warm yourself and be filled yourself. Go fill yourself. What good is it to say, go warm yourself when they have no clothing? Or go fill yourself when they have no food? Can't particularly do that. What's the second illustration?
Demons.
The demons believe also, and at least they're smart enough to be afraid, right? A man who says he has faith but has no works doesn't even seem to be smart enough to be afraid. Here you have the demons who believe also but shudder. Now, very interesting thing. If you look at verse 18, he says, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Now this phrase, by my works, and we're going to see it recur by works and by faith throughout the rest of the section, is a very interesting construction. It's actually ek. The preposition here is ek. What does the Greek word ek mean? Out of. So he says, show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith out of my works. My faith is going to be demonstrated out of the things that I do. You follow? Now that brings a little deeper idea here than just by. By sounds almost instrumental. It's that the works are being used to accomplish something, and that's true. But ek is this idea of out of my works, my faith is going to be demonstrated. The evidence for my faith is going to be seen out of the things that I do. Now, if that weren't enough, he uses this phrase 6 times between verse 18 and verse 25. Notice in verse 21, was not Abraham our father justified ek, ergon, out of works? He emerges out of works justified. It is out of works that Abraham receives his justification. And you see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of works, faith was perfected. Now, unfortunately, that's a poor translation. Because as a result of works is our word ek again. They translate that entire phrase, as a result of the works, really is the same phrase, ek ergon. So you see that faith was working with his works, and out of works, faith was perfected. Now, that to me is a particularly powerful phrase. It's out of works that faith is completed. Faith reaches maturity. Faith reaches its designed end. Out of works. It's not just simply a result of the works, and maybe we're splitting a little bit of a hair there. I mean, I don't think as a result of does damage to the text at all. But he's using the same phrase over and over again, and I just hate that they changed it. It's the idea that it's out of works that faith actually accomplishes what it's designed to accomplish. So if it's out of works that faith is perfected, what does that tell us if there are no works?
Your faith is not perfect.
Faith can't be perfect. Faith can't accomplish. It can't reach maturity because there's nothing to come out of. There's almost this sense with ek that it's post doing the work. It's after the works, that you emerge out of the works in a particular condition. And then you see it again in verse 24. You see that a man is justified ek, out of works, and not ek, out of faith alone. Verse 24 really brings on this whole meaning that he's been using this same phrase since verse 18 to say that you see that a man is justified out of his works and not out of faith alone. There's no way to emerge out of faith by itself justified. Faith by itself can't justify. Why? Because it's dead. Why? Because it's alone. It's by itself. It's useless, he said in verse 20. And so here in verse 24, he makes this summary that you see that a man is justified out of his works. He emerges out of his works justified, but he cannot emerge out of faith alone justified. There's no way to do that because his faith is alone and it's valueless. And then in verse 25, he uses the same phrase. In the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified out of works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? Just a cool little note to be, when you're looking for these patterns in the text. I had noticed it in verse 21. I had not noticed how he was using it throughout this whole section to make the point. And so you see it over and over again. It's out of works that this is accomplished, and not out of faith alone. To me, that really brings verse 24 to life. It really kind of helps connect that thought that he's been running through that whole section. Any questions about that? Do you see it in your text?
And in verse 22, it's, and by works faith was made perfect. That's out of works.
Yeah. Instead of by works there, it's ek.
Sorry,
It's out of works that faith was made perfect.
faith alone cannot accomplish its goal either.
That's the whole point that he's been making, is that faith, out of faith alone, you can't reach justification. You can't emerge from faith by itself justified. But you can when that faith causes you to do the work that God has designed, and so it's out of the works of offering Isaac that Abraham was justified. It's out of the work of receiving the messengers and sending them out by another way that Rahab found herself emerged justified. It's not during, it's after. It's that out of that experience you emerge a particular way. So interesting little textual note there that like I said, I had seen snippets of it, but it wasn't until I went all the way through it that I started to see it more clearly. Now it's interesting that he's going to use that same construction in chapter 3, verse 13, when he says, let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. I realize we're not to that verse yet, but that's the same construction. It's ek. It's out of his good deeds. He's going to demonstrate his wisdom. His wisdom is going to be given evidence out of his good behavior, his good way of life. And so it is a result, it's out of that behavior that wisdom is actually demonstrated. So interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get there.
Well, that's one Greek word that's worth bringing up in a Bible class.
Yeah, it's an easy one. I mean, most people know, and I'm not a huge one for going too crazy with the Greek in Bible class. I think we can lose some folks, although, obviously on Wednesday nights we're trying to teach more people that they need to concern themselves at least a little bit with the Greek. But yeah, I mean, most people know ecclesia, and, most people have been taught that church is the called out. Well, where do they get the called out? It's ek. It's that idea of out of. And so, that's an easy way to talk about that. Now, you don't necessarily need to talk about ek, but you can just say that the word there, by works, literally means out of works, and bring that nuance to the text. Questions, comments? Okay, as we begin chapter 3, we really have, for James, what would be a strong transition into a new thought. Now, James never leaves what he's talking about completely. There's always at least some connection with the ground that he's laid in the past. But here we do see a new topic being brought up. And the emphasis on the section starting in chapter 3, really through, I would say through the end of the book, but at least through chapter 5, about verse 12, verse 13, is this concept of worldliness. Now, he's been dealing with worldliness, but not as directly as he's going to here. Certainly the lack of wisdom that has been demonstrated in these early chapters have been demonstrated through a worldly point of view. In chapter 1, the idea of trials and poverty and wealth and the source of sin, the need for the word of truth all require us to shun some level of worldliness. The reason we get messed up in those situations is because we tend to take a more worldly view than a wisdom view, a godly perspective. And so worldliness factors in there. We see it in chapter 2, certainly brought up in the whole prejudice issue with the rich man and the poor man. Those Christians are demonstrating a worldliness. They're looking at them through the eyes of partiality, and so worldliness is rearing its head there, no doubt. And then even our view of law and the intertwining of faith and works requires us to have a proper perspective of worldliness. If we are not careful and our view is more worldly than godly, then it's easy for us to get caught up in these sins and caught up in these situations and not have the proper perspective. In all cases, we need what? What is the book always talking about we need?
Wisdom.
Wisdom. We need the ability to see these situations the way God sees them. And so now James is going to bring this idea of worldliness right to the forefront of the discussion. He's going to do it in the context of teachers first. In chapter 4, he's going to continue the thought from chapter 3, but he's going to deal with businessmen being worldly. In chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5, he's going to talk about rich men who are dealing with things only in a worldly perspective. And so it's this idea that worldliness is really a challenge. And when we allow worldliness to creep in to our spiritual life, they can distort what our true purposes are. They can distort how we behave. They can distort how we speak. It can distort how we teach, or even the motivations we have for teaching. And so we've got to be very careful. Now, he's going to connect this whole concept of worldliness with the tongue, probably most strongly here in the beginning of chapter 3. This section from chapter 3:2 all the way through verse 12 is really dealing with how we need to deal with the tongue. Now, I've mentioned it before, he's talked about use of the tongue in every chapter. And now he's going to kind of bring that discussion to a head. It's not that he's going to stop talking about it. He's going to continue to mention it in chapter 4 and chapter 5. But this seems to be the section in which he gives it the most attention. Control of the tongue and the meekness of wisdom are indications of the presence of wisdom in our life. The ability to control our speech oftentimes shows a more spiritual focus for us than a worldly focus. And so he's going to connect that idea of wisdom and control of the tongue together. And he's going to begin talking with teachers. Now, some people accuse James of rabbit chasing. This whole Proverbs of the New Testament kind of concept. I think we've seen up to this point that he's really stayed on task very, very well. If there's one area of the book that I will say you kind of see this little rabbit chase, it's right here in chapter 3. Now, it's connected, but he makes a general point about teachers in 3:1. And then in verse 2, he broadens that out to everyone, and then he has this discussion of the tongue and the importance for everyone to control the tongue. And then he comes back to the idea of a teacher specifically in chapter 3, verse 13, when he says, "Who among you is wise and understanding?" That term would certainly be something that would be connected to those who teach, those who claim to have wisdom, those who claim to have an understanding, knowledge. That's an Old Testament phrase that's often connected with teaching. And so we really don't have much doubt that he comes back to the idea of teaching in verse 13. But from 2 to 12, it's just this general discussion of the tongue. And so he kind of starts out talking about teachers, then moves to a general discussion about the tongue, then comes back to the idea of teachers in verse 13. Now, I think the discussion about the tongue is still related to the teachers. I don't see any reason that it's not. He's including more than just teachers. and we'll try to make the connection with teachers as we go through. But he does broaden the scope of the discussion in verse 2. So he starts out in verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment." He begins, "Let not many of you become teachers." This is a didaskalos. This is one who teaches. Now, didasko is that teaching word. We even talk about the didache. If you remember in language and research, you did research on a writing in the early church called the didache. It's the teaching. We talk about doing didactic work in our modern language. Something that's didactic is focused on teaching, accomplishing that idea of teaching, and it's connected to this word. And so he says, "Let not many of you become these didaskalos, these teachers." Now, we got to understand that in the first century, the idea of a teacher or a rabbi was certainly a very honored position in Judaism and even in early Christianity. Jesus was often called teacher. He was also called rabbi, but he was called teacher. Matthew 8:19, Matthew 23, 8, 9, and 10. We have that idea of Jesus being a teacher. And certain leaders in the early church were referred to as teachers. We see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 28 and 29, it says, "And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, administrations, and so on." And in verse 29, he says, "All are not apostles, are they? All are not prophets, are they? All are not teachers, are they?" And so this is one verse that shows us that this concept of teacher was a well-respected position. Notice it's listed along with apostles and prophets. Those who teach were held in very high esteem. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, a passage that we're all familiar with, says, "He gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers to the church, for the building up of the body, for the edification of the church." And so the idea is that there is a position, there is a skill set, if you will, for those who teach. Now, it's interesting that he says, "Let not many of you become teachers." Now, unfortunately, many in the brotherhood today take this very literally and suggest that, I don't know enough to be a teacher. I've only been a Christian for 35 years. I certainly couldn't teach a Sunday morning Bible class. I'm not a quote-unquote teacher. And so we need to be careful not to allow people to take this too long. We know from the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12, he says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God." There seems to be at least some aspect of that that demonstrates that there should be a time period in which teaching is expected. The New Testament talks a lot about people teaching. Titus chapter 2, 3 and 4. You've got the older women who are told that they should be teaching the younger women. They should find themselves in that position. And the church in and of itself is a teaching organism. In the Great Commission in Matthew 28, in verse 20, he said, "Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." The Great Commission was for them to go and teach everything that Christ had commanded. And so from the very beginning, the idea of teaching is an important role in the church. And we shouldn't let people take this verse and say, well, see, this is only for the select few. There are only a couple of folks. Not many within a congregation should be teachers. It's only for those individuals. But that's not what he's saying. This is very much like the passage in chapter 1. Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. If you don't read through the whole context of this, it's easy to stop with, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren." and not get the whole thought. But the whole thought is, let not many of you become teachers, knowing, just as we did in chapter 1, it was knowing that the testing of our faith produces endurance. Knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment. James uses a very similar construction to this argument as he did in the first part of the book with trials and understanding how joy and trials fit together. There's a knowing that's involved, and we should know before we start teaching that we will experience a stricter judgment. Now, it was not unusual for Jesus to condemn those who loved being called rabbi. You remember in Matthew chapter 23, verse 6 through 8, there's this discussion where Jesus is ridiculing those who like to be called rabbi, mainly because they like the honor that comes with being called rabbi. In Matthew 23, he said, they love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. And so the idea there was they were liking the benefits that come with being a teacher more than they were teaching for the right purpose. They liked the power and influence that came with it. And James is saying, be real careful about your motivation to become a teacher, because you're going to receive a stricter judgment. Now, it's interesting that word stricter judgment is actually megas. It's that word for great. In this particular case, he's using it from the standpoint of it means something in a more severe way. Megas there would be great, above the standard in intensity is the idea of that word, using megas there. Megas crema. Now, Charles, you're doing judgment, crema. That's your word, is judgment. And so there's a stricter judgment involved. Now, why would that be the case?
Because you could teach damnation or teach the truth.
Okay? So there's a responsibility for teachers that's involved in them teaching rightly. We've already talked about this a little bit. Where did we see it? Where did we see this idea of being careful how we teach?
Is it back in the... For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder?
No, it's further back than that. When he was talking about the word of truth, and he said that we must be quick to hear it and do what? Slow to speak it. Remember, we made a connection with this idea in 3:1. One aspect of slow to speak may be that, do you understand the stricter judgment that comes along with teaching? There's a responsibility to teach accurately. And if you're not going to teach accurately, you're going to receive a stricter judgment. Now, why is that, though? I mean, you can preach falsely, or you can preach truth. The teacher has both of those options. But why is that going to incur a stricter judgment than the average person?
Because we can take a lot of people with us.
Okay. What do we claim when we get up to teach?
Claim to know the truth.
We claim that we are wise and understanding. He's going to use that phrase in verse 13, but we are saying we are wise and understanding as far as this goes. We have the knowledge to teach this to you. You should listen to us. You should follow me. You should do what I tell you because I'm teaching you properly. By making that claim, we need to be very careful that we're actually doing what we claim, right? Otherwise, we're going to get ourselves in trouble because we're not teaching wisdom. We're not imparting knowledge. We're teaching false doctrine. And Peter's going to really deal with this a lot in his second letter, dealing with the false teachers. He talks about how they twist and distort the Scriptures, how they do violence, if you will, to the Scriptures. If you notice in 2 Peter, chapter 3, verse 16, he's talking about Paul in his letter, speaking in them these things, in which some things are hard to understand, but then he says, which the untaught and the unstable distort. That's the idea of to do violence to it, to twist it. They distort the scriptures as they do the rest of their scriptures to their own destruction. These people they're distorting and doing violence to the text teach that as they do the rest of the scriptures, and it's to their own destruction, but it's also to the destruction of those that follow what they teach. And so we have this idea of a stricter judgment. Now, there are a couple of places where we see this idea of degrees of punishment in the afterlife. Now, we don't need to chase this very far, but in Luke chapter 12, verse 47 and 48, he says, and that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in according to his will receive many lashes, but the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. And that's our famous passage of, for everyone who has been given much, much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much, of them they will ask all the more. So you have this idea of some will receive many lashes, some will receive few. Doesn't mean that there's no punishment. It does seem that there is a stricter level of punishment there. And here in James chapter 1, it tells us that different people are going to be judged with stricter judgment than others. Now, in this particular case, it's the teachers. I'm not aware of another passage anywhere that talks about anyone else receiving any stricter judgment. But it's simply because a teacher is making a claim. When you get in front of people, you are telling them that you are worthy to be listened to, that you have studied God's Word to a level at which you are capable of teaching them and leading them, and you have to recognize that that responsibility is going to cause God to look at you more strictly. Did you really? Now, where this, I think, comes into particular problem, and I see this from a lot of preachers, and it terrifies me. And I shouldn't say a lot of preachers. I see this in some preachers. And that is, Saturday night, what am I going to preach about tomorrow? I don't know. I think there's a couple of outlines online. Maybe I'll just go through sermons online or executable sermon outlines. And, this one looks kind of good. I kind of like this. And they slap something together and they get up there and they teach it. Is that wise and understanding? Are you demonstrating that you're wise and understanding in that?
No.
No. And you open yourself up, if you're not careful, to teaching something that's not accurate. It's not true. And if you're not careful with that, you are going to receive a stricter judgment. You may receive punishment for that teaching. And so teachers in general have to recognize, and we need to do a good job of warning people, hey, when you take this step to become a teacher, it's a big deal. It's a trust that you are taking on. It's a commitment that you are making, and it should not be taken lightly. However, there is, as I mentioned, an impression throughout Scripture that you should be growing to become teachers. I talk to people who have been Christians their whole life, and they still don't think they know enough to teach their neighbor the gospel. Well, there's something wrong there. If they're not growing at that level to where they can at least teach their neighbor the truth, then they've got issues. They're not following what God has said. And I think, when you look at passages like John 15 about the vine, those branches that aren't bearing fruit are going to be pruned and thrown in the fire. I mean, he's very clear about that. So just because not many should become teachers does not mean I don't ever have an obligation to learn enough to become a teacher. I just need to recognize the importance of teaching and the responsibility that comes with it. You see it?
Sure. All Christians are called to be teachers.
Yep, I agree.
That's just the way it is.
Now, so why is this control of the tongue that he's going to get into in chapter 3, verse 2, so much of a problem for teachers. I mean, he's connecting this whole discussion on control of the tongue with teachers. Well, I think there's 4 particular areas that we could point to. First, teachers just simply have more of an opportunity to speak. They are more public. They are more in front of people. It's a preacher or a teacher uses their tongue in order to proclaim the gospel, to teach people. And so we have probably more of an opportunity to get in front of people as teachers than the average person does. That brings with it some inherent dangers. It can bring with it a lax attitude over time. Some laziness can creep in. We don't prepare as much as we should. We don't study as diligently as we should, and we figure, people trust me. I know enough that I'm not going to lead them off they're never, one fluff lesson isn't going to hurt. Well, that can be a problem long term. Number 2 is that teachers can be tempted to use their pulpits or their classrooms to boast of their own knowledge and put down those who disagree. I've certainly seen that happen in classrooms, in places where the teacher kind of feels like he's large and in charge. And I've seen teachers who, through intimidation, prevent people from speaking up much in their classroom. When they do raise their hand, they get flamed, and that sends a message to the rest of the people in class, don't challenge me, or I'm going to flame you publicly. And so it kind of sends that fear throughout the classroom that says, look, don't forget I'm the one in charge, and egos kind of start to take over a bit. Why are you laughing?
Because we have him teach their Bible. It was kind of like that. I mean, he's been teaching the same class for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, you just don't go to in his class and try to say anything. Cause I have, and I ended up leaving because I said I'm not going to argue with him. It's disturbing your
Right.
class.
You're going to get shot down.
Right.
And there's different ways that can happen, but the fact that they do that shows a couple of potential problems. One is that their egos run away and they just aren't open for anything discussion. I know this, you don't. Sit down, shut up, and listen to me. Well, that's not really the heart of someone who's trying to teach others. And the other is that it also demonstrates some selfishness and some pride that's going on. Philippians chapter 1, verse 17, he talks about those that proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives. And that can be those guys that they just like being in the classroom because that's their time to show off and get their 15 minutes of fame to some degree. I'm not saying that's their total motivation, but you see some of that in that dynamic of how they open conversations or how they encourage discussion or how they squash it and say, no, I don't want you challenging anything I have to say. Just listen, soak it up, take it in, and we're done.
He's a good guy. I just
course.
mentioned that it could have meant something else.
Right.
And it was like, no way.
I'll be honest with you, and this is hard, guys, and I get the defensiveness to some degree. You've put a lot of time into it. You seem to be being publicly attacked for what you're saying, but I want to challenge you guys and be learners as teachers. The members of your congregation can possibly teach you some things, and be open to listening to them. I'm thinking of one, Brad. You said something yesterday in class that was a critique of the teacher that was an important critique for you to make. We tend to start making assumptions about the text, and in the context of yesterday, I'm not going to go through the whole context, but it was talking about Peter and his wife and how, there's no proof in the text that he ever discussed it with his wife, and his wife probably wasn't very supportive and blah, blah, blah. And, Brad just made the point, we don't know any of that. For all we know, Peter was married to a Mary who said, the Lord has called you. Where's he called us to go? I'm with you wherever you lead me. That's very possible. The truth of the matter is we don't know because Scripture doesn't tell us. And it's usually in those areas like that that we get ourselves in trouble and we start teaching something that we have no basis to teach, and we embellish and we try to slant things so that it makes our point a little stronger. But how somebody accepts critique like that becomes very important. We were just in California on a lectureship, and I taught a particular thing, and Denny came up to me and said, "So what do you do with this after that?" And I hadn't thought that through maybe as completely as I thought, and I said, "Well, I think this," and he said, but have you ever looked at it this?" We spent 10 minutes. It was a very cool discussion. I learned a ton. It was a give and take back and forth of the perspective of that verse. And I took it very well. I didn't take it as criticism. I took it as, hey, I can learn more here. And he offered some things, and I think I showed him some things in the text that he hadn't looked at, and he learned a little bit. And so we left. Well, the next day we were in somebody else's class, and they made a statement that was a little questionable, and Denny went up to him, and I was with him, and went up to him and said, "What are you going to do with this?" He immediately got defensive. "Well, what are you talking about? That has nothing to do with it." I mean, there was a visible tensing up of, you're attacking me, and I don't like being attacked, and blah, 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 blah. Try to learn to have that spirit that is teachable. Now, I'm not saying let people run roughshod over you in a classroom environment. You do need to learn to control a classroom environment. You just can't let people, and there are going to be some with personalities that want to take over the whole thing. You've got to learn some techniques to help control that. But recognize that you don't know everything, and somebody may bring something to the table that could open your eyes to a perspective on a verse that you hadn't thought of before. Be teachable as well as be a teacher, and try to keep that pride and that using the pulpit or the classroom is that place to show yourself as the authority out. My experience has been people will see you as more of an authority when you're open to discussion, and when you see an area, you recognize an area where you can learn something more, and people will respect that. Number 3, false teaching can cause people to lose their salvation. This is the idea of why this is dangerous for teachers, and certainly we've already discussed this. Matthew 18:6 said, "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." You know, you've got children who need teaching. They're going to grow up with parents who teach them, teachers who teach them. There's a responsibility to teach them correctly. And if we cause people to stumble because of the way we teach them, certainly it would be better for us to drown in the depths of the ocean. We are going to receive that stricter judgment. And then number 4, the teacher also cannot easily claim ignorance. You know, a teacher can't say, but Lord, I didn't know that I was teaching that falsely. Really? You got up in front of those people and said, "Listen to me, I'm a teacher." And now you're going to tell me you didn't know? You're lying against the very fact that you said you were a teacher by getting up there.
It's hard to say that when you're supposedly have studied through the whole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong here. I mean, we all grow in our knowledge of things. And, you know, are we saying that everything that we've ever spoken or taught has been 100% absolutely accurate every single time? No, that's not my point. But we have a responsibility to be accurate in our teaching. We have a responsibility to teach people correctly so that their souls don't become endangered. And we as teachers can't claim ignorance if we are the ones that say, "I've studied this, I've looked at this, I'm about to teach you the truth about this." Well, we better make sure that we've studied it and that we're looking at it as accurately as we possibly can. We are going to have a responsibility for that. So in essence, what he is saying here is don't let many of you become teachers if you're not certain that you can control your tongue. You're not certain that your teaching ministry will yield peaceable results, and that you will be willing to shoulder the responsibility of your work, because you are going to receive a stricter judgment. Understand the seriousness of this job. Not just, hey, you know what? I like being up in front of people. It strokes my ego when all these little old ladies say, you know, that was a great Bible class. That was a wonderful sermon, preacher. Hey, you are one of the best preachers I've ever heard. And you can almost hear the helium tank filling your head as you walk out of the auditorium. We need to recognize that teachers are susceptible to that influence. That pride is easy to sneak in. Because you know what? It feels good when somebody says, that was a great Bible class. I learned a lot. That feels good. Man, preacher, that was a great sermon. I don't think I've ever heard a sermon that good on that particular subject. You just, man, knocked it out of the park. Well, guess what? That feels good. But if that becomes our motivation for teaching, we're going to forget the severity and the responsibility that we have. And then we start teaching to please others. We don't control our tongue, and we get into all kinds of problems. So verse 2, he says, for we all stumble in many ways. You see that he opens this up now beyond just teachers. We all stumble in many ways. This literally is we all stumble with respect to many things. And certainly he's right. Romans chapter 3, verse 23, for we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. 1 John chapter 1, verse 8 says, if we say that we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves and the truth isn't in us. We all stumble in respect to many different things in our life. But he says, if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Literally here, it's if anyone stumbles, does not stumble in word. It is in word. And it's interesting to me that this word, logos, the word that's being used here, every time that it's been used in this book so far, it's referred to the gospel, the word of truth. And so I think we have to suggest that there's at least some connection to that here. If anyone does not stumble in what he's in word, and in the context, in teaching what God's word has to say, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. When we learn to control our tongue, when we learn to use our words well, with wisdom, with gentleness, he's going to say later on in the chapter, that meekness, that power under control. When we learn to use our tongues in that way, then we are going to have disciplined the rest of ourselves. He's gonna make some interesting parallels here with the tongue. This little tiny piece of flesh in our mouth can get us into all kinds of trouble. I sometimes talk about having a chip. I don't know if when you guys were freshmen you heard me talk about that much, but we should have a little chip in our head that kind of controls what comes out of our mouth. And sometimes our chip is off. We aren't thinking about controlling what comes out. We just kind of spew forth whatever comes into our heads, and that we recognize is extremely dangerous. I'm sure you all have said things. Now, everybody in here is married. I'm sure you've all said things to your wife that after you said it, you went, maybe you said it to yourself, but that was a really stupid thing to say, and I'm going to regret that. Right? I mean, maybe you said something a little harsher than you intended. Maybe you made a joke that she didn't think was funny. Why? Because she's not a guy, and guys sometimes make jokes that we think are funny, but women often don't see as funny. Or maybe you just, for whatever reason, slipped and said something that she just didn't react well to. Well, that's happened to all of us. We all stumble in what we say. But when we learn to control that chip, when we have control of that chip, it flows throughout the rest of our life as well. If we can control this little piece of flesh in our mouth, we're going to find that we have ratcheted into control many other aspects of our life as well. Because the tongue is one of the more difficult things to control. He's going to talk about that. And so it's that idea that if we're able to control what we say, if we're able to not stumble in word, we are a complete man. Now that's our perfect man. That's our teleos word again. And it's the idea of we have reached maturity. We're a more complete man. We've controlled other aspects of our life as well, not just our tongue. It'll be demonstrated in a control of our tongue. We'll be able to show that we've got the rest of our life together by being able to control our tongue as well. Because he says that mature man is able to, has the power to bridle the whole body as well. The tongue demonstrates control in other areas of our life. Jesus said, out of the mouth reveals what?
Things of the heart.
The heart. Now, he's not talking about the thing that pumps blood in our chest. He's talking about that center of our thinking. Your heart throughout Scripture is that which leads you. It's not just that emotional thing that leads you. It's that intellectual thing that leads you. It's where our passion is, where our love is, where our knowledge is. It's that heart that is demonstrated through our mouth. So if we're able to control our tongue, we're revealing a controlled heart. You follow? We're disciplining our heart to think in certain ways, and that affects our whole body. So that perfect man who's able to not stumble in what he says, he's reached maturity. He's reaching a designed end. And it's going to be affected, it's going to be demonstrated through his ability to bridle his whole body as well. Now, in Psalm 39, verse 1, talking about guarding the tongue, it says, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. And I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle while the wicked are in my presence. But notice at the beginning of the verse, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. You see, the way we behave often has an influence in how we speak. If we're not guarding our ways, if we're not controlling the direction that we're walking in the world, we're not going to do a good job of bridling our tongue either. But if we are guarding our ways, if we're looking at our behavior, if we're controlling how we behave and how we act, then oftentimes that's going to be demonstrated in the ability to control our tongue as well. Jesus said in Matthew 12:37, by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. And it is that idea that we recognize that there's a consequence. Remember earlier in the book we had the guy who thought himself to be religious but did not bridle his tongue? What's he forgotten? He's forgotten what he saw in the mirror, right? He forgot what God's Word told him, but what has he really forgotten?
Forgotten to change.
Okay, well, he's forgotten to change it, but he's forgotten what Jesus said in Matthew 12. You're going to be judged by those words. I mean, you're going to be judged by what comes out of your mouth. Isn't that enough to tell you that you should bridle your tongue? Now, it's interesting. He's going to use this word bridle a few times throughout the section, so kind of notice it. He used it back in chapter 1, verse 26, talking about the man who didn't bridle his tongue. And now he says that this man who does not stumble in word, does not stumble in what he says, is a perfect man, able, having the power to bridle his whole body as well. And then he's going to talk about these horses. He's going to move into this idea of the horses. He's going to actually give us two illustrations of this point. The first one he's going to talk about controlling horses, and the second one he's going to talk about these great ships. And so in verse 3, he says, now if we put the bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. So make a connection between that and what he said in verse 2. What's the illustration showing us? Brad?
tiny bit, put it in a great big horse, and you can lead him to anywhere you want to. And he's using that as an analogy of our tongue, little bitty thing.
Yep. Notice
Unbridled, it's
Yeah.
going to take us all kinds of crazy places.
well, notice the connection with bridling. Verse 2, we have the power to bridle our whole body as well. And so then he gives us this illustration of the horse. If we control the horse's mouth, what do we have control of?
The whole horse.
The entire horse. Now, I don't know if any of you have dealt with horses much. And I haven't either, but I've talked to some folks who have, and I used to have a friend who had horses, and it was interesting to watch her control this horse. First of all, horses are big animals. I know people that are terrified of horses just because of their size. What are they, 600, 700 pounds? I mean, horses are good-sized animals, very strong. But once you get that bit in their mouth, they calm down quite a bit. Why? Well, there's some pain there. There's some pressure on their mouth there, and that lets them know that when I pull on this and give you that pressure, I want you to do something. And once you get that bit in their mouth, you tug on the rein to the left, and guess what their head does? They move their head to the left. Why? Why do they move their head?
Because it hurts.
Well, because if I move my head, it's going to reduce that pressure, right? You're going to stop pulling on me, but by moving their head, they now move their whole body in that direction. And when you want to move them to the right, you tug on the right, and they move to the right. You control this entire animal through his mouth. Well, that's exactly what he just said in verse 2. The man who doesn't stumble in what he says controls his whole body is controlled through his mouth. He demonstrates control of his whole body by bridling his tongue, by controlling his speech. Now, who's in charge of the horse? The rider, right? The rider decides where the horse goes. Okay? So we have this idea of the horse. And then he says, look at the great ships also. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. What controls these so great ships?
The person, the rider.
The pilot.
Pilot.
He calls him a pilot. Notice it's not the rudder that controls. The rudder is the same in this illustration as the bit in the horse in verse 3. And a lot of people think he's talking about the rudder. But notice it's wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. The ship is steered, regardless of the wind, regardless of the size of the ship. The ship is steered in the direction the pilot wants it to go. So go back to verse 2. We are the pilot of our tongue. We decide what's going to come out of our mouth. We're the rider of the horse. We decide to steer the whole body or none of it at all. It's up to us. It's wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. That's really the idea. Now, it's fascinating to me that this illustration is even bigger than that of the horses. He says that these ships are so great. They're so large and are driven by strong winds. Now, what's that for us?
Her desire.
Okay. First, you've got just your own desires. He talked about that back in chapter 1, right? Each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Is that not a strong wind that blows in our life? You better believe it. What's another strong wind that attempts to influence the direction of the ship in our life?
Well, verse 2 is talking about the word.
Okay.
So, the word.
But here he's making the contrast that we steer regardless of which direction the wind's blowing. So I think he's making a slightly different. Certainly we should allow God's word to cause us to steer the ship in the right direction, right? But he says that these ships are so great and are driven by strong winds. There are winds that are going to catch the sails and want the ship to go in a certain direction. But we decide whether we want to go in that direction, and we steer. You follow?
Yeah.
So what are some other strong winds that blow?
Other people.
Biggie, right? My teenage daughter was getting very frustrated with every youth rally that she went to talking about peer pressure. Because it seems like that's all we talk to kids about is peer pressure, peer pressure, peer pressure. But guess what? We don't talk to parents, we don't talk to adults about peer pressure. When was the last time
It
you
doesn't
were
happen to
in
us,
an adult? Yeah, it stops when you graduate high school, apparently, because we stop talking about it. And I'll be honest with you, I see it demonstrated more in adults than I do in many of the teens. Now, that's not to say that peer pressure isn't something that we should be talking about with teens. We should. But we shouldn't stop talking about it. We're blown around by winds of other people constantly. Our circle of influence, our friend circle, whatever that is, brings some pressure on us sometimes. Sometimes in good ways, sometimes in not so good ways. But we have to decide whether we're going to let the ship be blown wherever it's going to go, or whether we're going to steer. What else?
I'm thinking chapter 1, verse 2, when we fall into those various kinds of trials.
Okay?
Stuff happens.
In life, and we can let those winds control the direction of our life. We can let those control the direction of our body, even our tongue to that degree. Doctrines that are being introduced, false doctrines that are being introduced in the world, can be strong winds. We could spend probably all day talking about what these strong winds can be. But the idea is that the strong winds don't control where the ship goes. There is still a very small rudder. Now, in our illustration, what is our small rudder?
It's our tongue.
The rudder's the tongue. And we decide, we steer the ship with the very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. See, that's this idea of if you can control your tongue, you can bridle the whole body as well. Because now we're in charge of where the ship goes. We're steering the small rudder. We've got control on what it says and what direction it points our ship. And that determines where the ship goes. And too many people forget that. They don't give enough credence to how small this rudder is, but yet what great influence it has over the direction of the ship. But it's at the mercy of the pilot. We have to learn to pilot our tongues. We have to steer the ship. Otherwise, we're just going to be blown back and forth. Now, he's used this illustration of being blown about earlier in chapter 1, verse 6, talking about the man who must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. You see, this ship, if we don't steer this little rudder, it's going to end up in the rocks. It's just going to be blown all over the place. Nothing's guiding it. Nothing's steering it. We're going to damage people's lives. We're going to damage our own life. And all because we didn't take control of the little tiny rudder and steer it where it should go. We've got to learn to turn on our chip. And there are times, even here at school, where, I see the joking. And, guys, this is, for whatever it's worth, the coarse jesting. As guys, we have a tendency to use cut-down humor, and we think it's funny, and it is, and we go for a while. But there's an escalation of that naturally takes place with guys. You cut me down, I got to one-up you, right? And as my dear departed mother used to say, there's a line that you can cross. And oftentimes, we get so involved in the banter and the wit and the humor that we're no longer steering the ship. And the next thing you know, we've not just crossed the line, we have leapt completely over it. And we say something that offends somebody, or we say something that we should, and we reveal an aspect of ourselves that we demonstrate as a little out of control, don't we? We've got to learn to turn that chip on. Okay, good one. You got me. I can escalate this, and we can see how far this goes. But guess what? Right now, I'm just being driven by the strong winds, aren't I? I'm just driven by the wind of humor and how much attention I'm getting from others and whether other people think it's funny. And if everybody's laughing, that's going to encourage me to go further. You know what? Next thing you know, you're going to say something you're going to regret. There's an illustration, and I find it fascinating. I saw it first at a youth rally a long, long time ago. And I know some of the ladies have done it at ladies' days and that kind of stuff. But get two people to come up, and you're going to have a contest. And you have 2 tubes of toothpaste. Have you ever seen this? And you tell them up front, there's 2 parts to this contest. The first part is we're going to see who can get all of the toothpaste out of the tube the fastest. Okay? So your job is get all of the toothpaste out of the tube as much as possible. We'll see who can get it done the fastest. Ready, set, go. And everybody laughs, and they're squeezing the toothpaste out. And they, finally somebody's done. And they, I win. Okay. The second part is to see who can get it all back in the tube the quickest. And the reality is you can't. And the lesson is it's the same with our words. Once they come out of our mouth, there's no putting them back in the tube.
Oh, that's good.
You can't get them all back. Now, you can regret having said them. You can apologize for having said them. You can say, I didn't mean to say that. But the reality is that the damage that's been done by those words, you can't ever put back in the tube. And we've got to recognize that. We need to stay in control of the ship. We need to constantly pilot the ship. And so he says in verse 5, so also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. Boy, is that not true or what? It's this idea that the tongue, even though it's such a small part, in contrast to the big horses and the great ships, the tongue is such a small part of our body. I mean, our pinky is almost as big as our tongue, and yet your pinky's not going to get you in nearly as much trouble as your tongue is. It's such a small part, and yet it boasts of such great things. In Judges chapter 9, you have Jotham's fable, the bramble in Jotham's fable. And the bramble says to the great trees that I can determine the course of all of you. All of you must recognize my power. You should take refuge in my shade. Well, the reality is that little tiny bush can't give shade to those big trees. That's not possible. And yet, through ego and through pride and lack of self-awareness and a sense of overimportance, we can speak out through our mouth things that boast of great things. We can say anything, but doing it and living it is another whole story. Talk is cheap. And talk is so cheap that it's easy to spend the money on the words. And sometimes we spend money on words when we should just shut up. I mean, the reality is that we need to at times learn to just shut up. And I know that that's, maybe offensive to some, but I'm going to learn to control my life. And if I'm going to do that, the best course I can take sometimes is to just not say anything. It's better for me not to jump in unless I understand that I can control it. And when those emotions get going, it can be pretty tough. But notice what he says. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. Now, for some reason, I didn't write down the date. This has probably been about 8 years ago. We had a big fire in Colorado. It was called the Hayman Fire. The Hayman Fire actually was in the San Isabel National Forest. It was about 30 miles southwest of here. It burned 137,000 acres. 133 homes were destroyed, 1 commercial building, 466 outbuildings, and 3 people lost their lives. It cost almost $40 million to get it under control. And from here in Denver, the ash was actually landing here in Denver. You could see the smoke in the sky. At night, you could see the glow of the flames even from 30 miles away. That's how big this fire was. And it was started with 4 pieces of paper. A woman received a Dear Jane letter, basically, from her lover. She was a park ranger, and she got so angry she threw them into a campfire. But the wind was blowing. And it started those pieces of paper on fire, but they were so light that the wind pulled them up out of that campfire and blew them into the trees. And before she knew it, 137,000 acres were gone. 133 homes were burned.
Park ranger.
3 people are dead.
Huge.
Now, that started as a very small fire. But you see how great a forest was set afire from such a small flame. And that's the illustration he's giving us. This little piece of flesh in your mouth is a little tiny flame. But you can burn down entire forests with it. Yeah, Brad.
What was the name of that fire?
The Hayman Fire. You can look it up online. If you just search Hayman Fire, you'll find all kinds of stats about it. And for years, driving through that part of Colorado, it's still evident that it was significantly burned. I mean, there's
still some spots.
I mean, there's regrowth and it's coming back. But see, that's the idea. We say something and we hurt somebody and we say, oh, I'm sorry. Well, guess what? It's still going to take time for that forest to grow back, isn't it? I mean, I try to teach this to my kids, and this is a hard lesson for kids. You'd always teach your kids to say you're sorry, right? When they do something wrong, one of the first things, say you're sorry. Well, there's also comes a time as they get older where they don't understand why I'm sorry doesn't just fix everything. But it doesn't fix everything. I mean, I can say, yes, I forgive you. I appreciate that you're sorry. Yes, I forgive you. But the damage that you did isn't going to get fixed just by you saying you're sorry. And the same thing is true here. The forest is on fire. The forest has been burned. And it was started by such a small little flame. This little tongue in our mouth becomes this torch that can burn down so much. And he says in verse 6, and the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue, if we're going to control the tongue, we have to recognize the damage that it can do. We don't play with matches. Why? Because we can burn ourselves and we can accidentally set things on fire. Well, guess what? Your tongue's a fire. Don't play around with it. Learn to control it. I'm never going to accidentally set my house on fire if I don't strike matches in my house playing with them. You follow? And we have to recognize, if we're going to control our tongue, that it is a fire. It's the very world of iniquity. Unrighteousness is this word, adikios. It is the world of unrighteousness. Our tongue speaks out that which isn't righteous. It reveals attitudes and emotions and aspects of our life that we sometimes think we have under control. And he says that the tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the whole body as well. Now, set among our members, I think he's talking about the members of our body. The tongue is a member of our body, and it's set among our whole body. Remember, he connected this idea that the tongue is what, control of the tongue is how we control our whole body as well, back in verse 2. And here he says that the tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body. Now, this word for defiles is spiloo. It's a pollution word. It means to pollute. The tongue pollutes our entire body. It can pollute the whole person. Now, it's just this little tiny piece of flesh. It's this little rudder. It's this little flame in our mouth, but we can pollute our entire body. And notice he says, and sets on fire the course of what? And it's by implication our life. It sets on fire the course of our life. We can change the direction of our life by not controlling our tongue.
Or control it.
Huh?
Or control
Or
it.
control it. But see, at that point, we're steering. We're controlling the course of our life. But the point he's making here is that we can set on fire the course of our life. We can start a fire that we can't stop. Now, it's our life that we could be burning down. Now, certainly by implication, we can set on fire other people's lives as well. But it's the course of our life that he seems most interested in. It's the course of our existence that he's talking about. From birth to the grave, the entire course of our life is affected by our tongue. Not to sound like we're from the Lion King, but we are part of a cycle of life. We do not live in a vacuum. We don't live in isolation. What we do affects others, especially by what we say. Now you remember in chapter 2, verse 12, he said, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. I don't think it's by accident that he started with so speak. Because it's through our speech that we can set these fires. It's through our speech that we can burn down people's lives. Anybody ever heard of the Chicago fire? The Great Chicago Fire? Supposedly a cow kicked over a lantern, right, and started the fire. How does an entire city burn down from a fire that started in a barn? How does 137,000 acres burn down from a little campfire? What happens?
Spreads.
Well, yeah, it spreads, but what? How?
It consumes.
It's got
Okay.
something to feed off of.
Okay, there's fuel. So there's things to be burned. In this case, people's lives. But how does it spread? It certainly spreads, but how does it spread? What's the most dangerous thing in a fire? Wind. Didn't he just talk about the ships being driven by strong winds? You know, the Chicago fire blew from housetop to housetop. The ashes, the embers that are burning go up in the air because of the heat, and the wind blows them, and they land on a house 2 doors away. But guess what? It catches that roof on fire. And the wind stokes that, fans that flame, and that house catches fire, and the embers from that now blow, and they land somewhere else, and it catches the next thing on fire, and the next thing, and the next thing. I had a friend of mine that was a hot shot in Arizona. He was one of the guys that helicopter in, and they parachute into fires early on in the forest. And their job is to climb the trees and cut the tops of the trees off that are on fire. Because the fire isn't anywhere near the ground. It's at the tops of the trees, usually from lightning strikes. Lightning will strike a tree, it'll start to burn, and their job is they see the smoke, they get there, and they try to cut the tops out of the trees. Why? Because the wind is going to blow that fire from one tree to the next. and it's going to catch the next tree. Long before the bottom of the forest catches fire, you're going to have hundreds of trees burning from the top down. The point I'm making is that's how easy it is to spread that fire. And that's the illustration that James really is giving here with this whole great forest that is set afire from such a small flame, and the fact that we can set the course of our life on fire. Those fires are very hard to control, and I've seen congregations where through people not controlling their tongue, they start a fire in the congregation, and guess what happens? The winds blow, and it blows it to the next family. Who, Brad's in an argument with Charles, and Charles has said something vile to Brad, and Brad is offended, and he should be. Charles is being a jerk. And I jump in on Brad's side and say, you know what? Charles King is, and I go to Chris Crooks and said, did you know Charles King is a jerk? And he said something to Brad. And what am I trying to do? I'm trying to spread the fire, aren't I? And the next thing you know, Scott Pino says, well, wait a minute, I'm a friend of Charles. I know Charles. He's a good guy. He wouldn't have said that. And Michael Hite is spreading that to Chris Crooks. And he shouldn't have said anything about it. All of a sudden, you got a forest fire, right? And you got all of these different families that are involved. Put that fire out. You ever been in a congregation where that's happened? I'll tell you what, those are hard fires to put out. And how did they start? With the little tiny thing in our mouth, the stupid little piece of flesh in our mouth, that through some careless words, through some gossip, through some harshness, whatever the case may be, we set on fire the course of our life. And notice what he says at the end of verse 6. And is set on fire by hell. You see, when we're not controlling our tongue, who is controlling it? There's only one source, and it comes from hell. It's not from God. How do we know that?
He only gave good and perfect gifts.
That's exactly right. Only good and perfect gifts come from the Father of lights. And this is not a good and perfect gift. If it's burning your life down, it's not a good and perfect gift. So where does it come from? It demonstrates that we're being blown around by the winds that Satan is blowing. We're not steering the ship the way we should. We're not in control of the rudder. And we are setting people's lives on fire, including our own. And the reason is because we're listening to hell, not heaven. We lack what?
Godly wisdom.
Wisdom. Now, it's interesting to note that this is the only place outside of the Gospels that this word, hell, occurs. Gehenna. There are some places in the New Testament that are translated hell, but often, except with this occurrence, the word is Hades, not hell, even if it's translated hell. This is the only word outside of the Gospels where Gehenna is used, our word for hell. Now, he's going to say that this wisdom that causes this burning down of people's lives, he's going to get back to the teachers, and he's going to talk about this wisdom that does not come down from above, this wisdom that's driven by bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in verse 14. In verse 15, he's going to say this wisdom that does not come down from above is earthly, natural, and demonic. It comes from Satan. Now, we can be those that strive to follow God, but we can still be used by Satan to burn people's lives down, can't we? Because we stop piloting the ship. We stop steering the horse. We stop controlling our tongue. And as a result, the fire is set. And people's lives are going to burn. And saying I'm sorry isn't going to fix it. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube sometimes. And so learning to control it to begin with demonstrates that we can bridle the whole body. It will just control this one stupid little piece of flesh in our mouth. We can gain control of our whole body. We can steer our entire life according to the way God wants it steered. Now, he says in verse 3 and in verse 7 and verse 8, he makes another illustration of this. And he's going to talk about the beasts and the birds and the reptile. And this particular passage I used to always struggle with. I don't know if you have or not. But he's going to talk about taming the beasts and the fact that we cannot tame the tongue. Notice in verse 7. He says, "For every species of beasts and birds and of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race." Now, to start off with, I'm sitting in modern day America thinking, we haven't tamed every aspect of every animal and every kind of king. I mean, we haven't turned them into pets. We haven't tamed them. Well, that's not really what this word tamed means. The word tamed here means to reduce to stillness or to quietness. It means to subdue or control. And so the reality is that mankind really has controlled every species of beast and bird and reptile and creature of the sea. We control them. We kill them. We have dominance over them.
Yeah, we don't live in fear like they did in Job's time.
No. And in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness, and let him rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' And God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" And I think that's the idea that James is talking about. Now, can somebody point to some obscure species of cat that's in the middle of the jungle in South America and say, "We haven't tamed them"? Oh yeah, watch this. I can set a trap for him and I can catch him and put him in a zoo. You follow? I mean, it's just the idea that we have the power to do that, not necessarily that we've done it with every single kind of animal. God said, subdue the earth, the fish, the birds, rule over them. You are in charge of all of them. And he gave us that ability, and we have demonstrated that ability. I mean, even with things like the blue whale, the largest living creature on the planet. Well, if we want to, we can get in a ship and go out and kill one. That's unfortunate that we do that, but I mean that demonstrates our control over them as we have that ability. And so that's what he's using by this idea of tamed. It's not turn them into a pet. It's the idea of subdue them and keep them in control. But he says, but no one can tame the tongue. Now, it's interesting that tame the tongue here is actually an aorist middle infinitive. And so with middle, what's middle bring to the idea?
Something you do for yourself.
But no one can tame the tongue themselves, is in essence what he is saying. If we're going to do it, we're going to need what?
God's help.
We're going to need God's help, and what's our word?
Wisdom.
We're going to need wisdom. You follow? So he's not saying that no one can tame the tongue at all. He's saying that no one can tame it by themselves. Now, he uses an illustration that I love, and that is, it is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. I love to go to the zoo. I mean, I like to go to Africa and see the animals out in the wild, but I love to go to the zoo. And I love to look at the big cats. Anybody else like to go see the lions and tigers and the leopards and that kind of stuff? And what are they always doing? Have you ever noticed? I mean, they'll have a spot through their whole cage where they're worn down to the dirt. The same thing, and they walk back and forth. And they look at you like, you know what? I've been in this cage for 15 years, but you open that door? Now, is that animal tamed? No. He's controlled. Right now, he's controlled. But what happens if you leave that door open?
You rip your head off.
And that's exactly what happened a number of years ago at the Denver Zoo. We had a woman, his name was Ashley Pfaff. She was killed in 2007 by a jaguar that had been a captive animal for over 12 years. She went in to do something in the cage. As she left, she pulled the door closed behind her and journeyed down a long hallway, but the door didn't latch. And that animal that had been kept in a cage, that had been controlled for 12 years, got loose. And it jumped her and it killed her. That's the restless evil that James is talking about. We keep our tongue in control, but it's just like that cat.
Just waiting.
Just let me out. Just let me tell Chris what I really think of him. I just want that chance to just really go up to Chris and just give him a piece of my mind. Right? That's the restless evil that we have, this idea of our tongue. So often we're just waiting for a chance to set it free, to turn it loose. But if we have wisdom and we have that godly perspective, we're going to keep that tongue under control because we understand we're going to be judged by the words that come out of our mouth. But in the immediate context, we also understand that we can burn people's lives down if we let that cat out. There's a reason the zookeepers made sure every single time for over 12 years that when they closed that door, it latched shut tight to keep that cat under control. The one time that door wasn't secured, that cat gets out and kills somebody. The one time we don't watch what we say. The one time we let that cat out. We can kill somebody. And we can burn our lives down. It's constant visual. We've got to be vigilant to constantly work to tame that tongue, to keep it under control, to subdue it, to keep it quiet. It's a restless evil and full of deadly poison. This word for deadly poison is thanatephros. I knew I wasn't going to do it right. Thanatephros. It's a compound word from thanatos, which is death, and pharaoh, which means to bring. It carries with it death.
That was deadly poison.
Deadly poison. Our tongue is full of this death-carrying poison. And if we're not careful, we're going to kill somebody with it. Now, kill them physically? Probably not, although that's certainly possible. But most likely, we can kill them spiritually, can't we? We can cause their death. We can poison their life. Ever know anybody that has dealt with somebody from the church but has walked away and their answer now is, I would never go back there? The way they treated me, if that's church, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Where are they spiritually? They're dead. They're lost. And why? Because somebody didn't control their tongue. I had prime example. And guys, this is one that's very real. And I'm not making excuses for this woman, but I studied with a teacher of mine, and she obeyed the gospel. I'd gone back to graphic design school, studied with her later. She ended up obeying the gospel here at Bear Valley, started attending church. She had a Catholic background. Went to Bible class one day, and I wasn't in there with her. And a guy who was teaching Bible class decided it was Catholic bashing day. We're going to talk about all those Catholics that are all going to burn in hell. Every single one of them, because they are false teachers and they're this and they're that, and he just went off on Catholics. Well, she left that day and she's never been in a Church of Christ since, as far as I know. Now, she has to take some responsibility for that. I get that. But what happened? Somebody didn't control the little flame in their mouth. And with heartless words, the way he presented, he could have presented the doctrine in a gentle, loving, compassionate way, but instead used it to burn somebody's life down. Now, I'm not saying that he's the reason she's now lost, but he certainly contributed to her walking away. Now, there are lots of other churches she can go to, and I realize she can find another Lord's church, and she's got a responsibility to the truth that she needs to respond to. But that's the problem, is he didn't control his tongue. In a teaching situation, and guess what happened? People leave. We can see this happen all the time. We need to control the cat. We need to keep the door shut. We need to make sure that it's tightly latched behind us, because that deadly poison can kill someone. Then in verse 9, he makes another contrast. He's used this idea of the impact of our tongue. Now he's going to show, kind of, if you will, the illogical nature of not controlling our tongue. He says, with it, talking about the tongue, this restless, evil, and deadly poison, with this tongue, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it, we curse men, who have been made in the likeness of God. Now, these are both continuous action verbs. With it, with the tongue, we eulogize. That's our word. It's eulogeo, to speak well of. That's what a eulogy is, right? I mean, today, there was a funeral that Wayne Berger went to, and there was probably a eulogy. A eulogy is when people get up and speak well of the dead, is the idea. They talk about their life, they talk about their kids, they talk about the things that happened. It's not the sermon, it's a eulogy. You speak well of their life. You talk about the things they accomplished, the things that they did. That's this word. That's where we get our word eulogy from. It's from this word, eulogeo. So we speak well of our Lord, our Master, and our Father. We eulogize God, and it's a present active. This is a continuous action. We are constantly speaking well of God, our Lord and Father. And with it, we're also constantly, present tense, cursing men. Now, this idea of cursing is not to, he's not talking about bringing down God's curse of eternal punishment on someone. He's simply talking about wishing evil or ruin on people. Now, I had a friend one time, and this is a little bit of a rabbit chase, but not really. I had a friend of mine one time who talked about the heinous nature of the phrase "go to hell." And I don't know if, we seem to classify foul language. There's really bad language, and there's some that aren't so bad, and others that are, not so bad at all. And sometimes I think we kind of classify the idea of "go to hell" is not that bad. It's certainly not as bad as some other words that we know people use, right? But think of that thought. Think of the thought of telling someone, "Go to hell." Can you imagine how much you must hate someone to wish eternal punishment on them? And I know that people don't even think about it that way. I mean, they don't really think through the reality of that statement. But we curse men like that. But this just means to wish ruin or evil on them. We want bad things for these men. And these men have been made in the likeness of God. That word likeness is in the resemblance of God. God created these men, and we bless God. We speak nice of God. We speak well of Him and to Him. And the very creatures that He created, we curse. Does that make any sense? Now, He's already talked about us being a kind of first fruits among His creation, right? Christians in particular are a kind of first fruit. We're a pinnacle of God's creation, and yet we curse at each other with the same mouth that we honor the Lord. You know, I know Christians who have held grudges against people in the church for decades. And they don't have nice things to say about each other. That's this kind of idea. I mean, they speak evil against each other constantly. And they've forgotten that they are children of God. They are the pinnacle of God's creation. And they can come sit in the pew and sing praises and say, God, we love you. You are my master. You are our creator. Have mercy on me. I love you. You're great. But when it comes to George Smith, he's a crud, and I don't want to have anything to do with him, and I hope he burns in hell. Really? That can't be. It doesn't work. One of those two positions is false. Either we really don't love God and honor him, or we certainly don't see his creation the way he does. What do we lack? Wisdom. We're seeing things through worldly eyes. And it makes no sense. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not be this way. Yeah.
And you say with this word, it's not even to that level. It's just, I hope you get a flat tire on the way home.
Yeah, this is not the cursing for eternal damnation. This is just wanting bad things to happen to him. I just don't like him. I hope he loses his job. I hope they move to another state. I just don't want him. Anything bad that you can want for him to have happen to him. Yeah, I hope he has a flat tire on the way home. You know? Wait a minute. You just told God you love him. You just told God he's your master. Now, I don't think that it's out of coincidence that he uses the word kurios here. We bless our master. We say we serve God. He's our master. Is he going to tell that guy he hopes he gets a flat tire on the way home? No? Then why are we?
God gives his heir to the evil and the believer.
Yeah, absolutely. It causes rain to fall on the believer and the unbeliever. God shows mercy on us all. And so why don't we? Because we lack wisdom. We have a worldly perspective, and we aren't controlling our tongue. Out of the same mouth cannot come both blessings and cursings. It makes no sense, and it ought not be this way. If we have the proper perspective, if we're bridling our body, if we're controlling the rudder, if we're steering the ship, if we're steering the horse, then we must recognize what God wants us to do. And he would never dream of us wishing evil on people that he created in his own likeness. I don't care what they've done. I don't care what they did to you. I don't care what they said to you. You know what? Get over it. Forgive them. Because guess what? Aren't you going to turn around and ask God to forgive you? And what have you done to God? A lot worse than probably the guy across the pew just said about you, to be honest. If we're really honest with ourselves, we've probably been much worse to God than this guy is to us. And yet we're going to say, God, please forgive me. And he's going to say yes. And the man across the pew, you're going to say, but I'll never forgive him. Remember what James said back in 2:13? For judgment will be merciless to the one who has shown no mercy. You know, we have to learn to control this tongue. We have to not let the same thing. Now, it's interesting to me that we already saw that God is the source of every good and perfect gift. What was the point James was making about God when he made that point? That only good and perfect gifts come from God. Chapter 1, verse 17. What's his point?
Don't blame God for your temptation.
Okay, and God consistently does the same thing over and over again, right? He only gives good and perfect gifts. Only. He does the same thing every time. If it's a gift, it's a good and perfect gift, comes from God. Period. He doesn't go from one day offering you temptation to the next day giving you a good and perfect gift. But guess what? We're not like that, are we? Out of the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. We're the opposite of God in this respect. We need to learn to be consistent like God's consistent. We need to offer blessings out of our mouth. We need to make sure that we're offering encouragement, that we're looking to build people up, that we're striving to be consistent with our speech, because that's what the wisdom of God would have us do. And then using illustrations from the Sermon on the Mount, he's going to go through a series of contrasts to show that it shouldn't be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Now, this word fresh is the word glucose. What does that sound like?
Glucose, sweet.
Yeah, it's sweet. Out of the same opening does not flow sweet water and bitter water. This word bitter just means acrid or brackish. You're not going to get salt water and fresh out of the same opening. When you take a drink one time and it's sweet water, guess what? If you go back to get another drink, it's going to be sweet water. It can't change. It took the power of God to actually, it took a miracle from God to turn bitter water into fresh in Exodus 15, 23 to 25. You see, that water was bitter. And what came out of that opening was going to be bitter water unless God intervened. Well, guess what? We have to intervene. We have to determine what's going to come out of our opening.
That's what that word means, an opening.
Yes, it is an opening. And guess what? You got an opening here. What are you going to let come out of your opening? You've got to be the pilot. You've got to steer the ship. You've got to decide whether sweet water is going to come out or bitter water. And we need to do a lot more sweet water. Now, I'm gonna point something out, and it's not intended to be harsh in any way, shape, or form. But did you notice when we read this morning from Scripture? Did anybody notice a thread of thought from the Scriptures we read?
Sweet and wholesome, and
So encouraging.
that's why I didn't say nothing. I had one I was going to read. I should have.
What were you going to read?
Philippians 2:14. Do everything without grumbling and complaining, because I've been struggling with it.
But did you notice how many of them were the strong doctrinal positions? There's going to be punishment if we're not careful. There were warnings. Now, warnings are encouragement, so I'm not saying that. But how often when we teach people do we just throw all the warnings at them and not try to build them up, not work to help them see the good things that they're doing? Now, if there's bad things in their life that are keeping them away from the love of God, we need to show those things to them. That's not what I'm talking about. But how often do we strive to make our speech sweet, like honey, sweet? Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I got a lot I want to say. And I have to say, you know what? I can put out bitter water here, but I can also find a way to do this in a sweet way. I can find a way to have this taste good. I can still teach. I can just teach gently. I don't have to be harsh. I don't have to be in their face. I can give them that water that's got a good taste to it, but is going to show them what needs to be done. We need to be looking for those passages sometimes that help encourage others. Now, a passage that warns us is an encouragement. I'm not saying that it's not. But especially with new Christians and people that we're trying to teach early on, those things that we can do to show them the love of God, to show what the outcome is, to show how God's watching over us and He's going to protect His people and how He loves us enough to send His Son. Those kinds of passages are sweet passages, are they not? I mean, they really show us the love of God. It also should remind us that I want to be loved by God. Well, what do I need to do that? I need to obey Him, and we can teach those doctrinal positions. But it's interesting that this word fresh really is the word sweet. It should, in Revelation chapter 10, verse 9, it's translated as sweet. We can't have bitter water and sweet water coming out of the same opening. We have to decide. Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives? I mean, do you go to the fig tree to get olives? No, why?
That's crazy.
Why is that crazy? I want olives. I'm going to go to the fig tree. What do you expect from the fig tree?
Figs.
Figs. Why would you go to it for olives?
Because you're insane.
Then why would you talk to God in blessing and curse His creation? Makes no sense. What tree are you demonstrating? If you're cursing men, is it a good tree or a bad tree? If you're praising God, is that a good tree or a bad tree?
Good.
So can you be both? Jesus said you can't be both. You can't have both trees. And can a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. In Matthew 12, 32 and following, Jesus talked about this concept of a good tree and good fruit. And a bad tree and bad fruit. And the reality is a good tree produces good fruit. And a bad tree produces bad fruit. Period. End of story. You cannot get good fruit from a bad tree. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Matthew 12:34. It's out of the overflow of the heart that the mouth speaks. If what comes out is bitter, there's bitterness in your heart. You need to get rid of it. You need to purge that from your heart. And allow the opening of your mouth and your tongue to show forth the sweetness of your heart, the gentleness of your heart. Whether we're teachers or not, we need to learn to control our tongue. And we need to learn to control and pilot our entire life in relation to our tongue. Now, he's gone from specifics of teachers to this, we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, so he opened this up. But certainly there is a thread of thought through verse 2 and through 12 related to teachers. When you're in the classroom, when you're teaching others, you have a responsibility to understand that you're going to receive stricter judgment. You need to teach truth, and you need to teach accurately. But there's also this idea of understanding how much of a responsibility you have and that you can set people's lives on fire. We need to treat people gently when we can. We need to recognize that we can burn down their lives if we're not careful. We've got a responsibility to not let that restless evil, that cat, out of the cage just because we've been given the stage to speak in front of everybody and we feel like we can say whatever we want. Now, this may get me in trouble, but I'm going to say it anyway. We have a number of graduates who cannot hold a job. And one of the reasons they can't hold a preaching job is what we usually hear back from them is, well, those people just wouldn't endure sound doctrine. And they go to the next place. And they're there a year and they get fired. Well, those people just wouldn't endure sound doctrine. And they're there, they go to the next place and they're there a year and a half, 2 years, and then they get fired. Well, those people wouldn't endure sound doctrine. What's wrong?
He's not saying it in the right way. He's not giving it to him in a sweet way. It's too harsh.
No one's ever suggesting, and James doesn't either, that we should compromise doctrine. But there's a way to do it with sweet water, and there's a way to do it with bitter water, and people aren't going to drink bitter water for too long before they fire you. And for a guy to say, but I'm preaching truth, they just need to accept it, is not enough, guys. It's not. When you go into a new work and you figure you're going to solve all their problems in the first 6 months and you're going to tell them everything that they're doing wrong and you're going to teach about every false doctrine that they believe and you're going to
point out the unscriptural marriages in the congregation, and you're going to preach a whole series on MDR and tell them they're all going to hell if they don't repent. You are not going to change that congregation one iota. They're going to fire you, and you're going to be on the road again, and you're going to spend the rest of your life saying, but they just won't endure sound doctrine. Guys, we have to learn to teach with great patience and understanding. It's going to take time. I'm not suggesting that we get soft on any of those doctrines. But you've got to recognize that you have to teach it in a way that's palatable to the people that are hearing it so that they will hear it. And so that they can learn from it. And that over time you can teach them. And just getting up and bullying over everybody is not going to get you what you want. And it's not going to achieve the righteousness of God. People are going to get angry. And all they're going to do is fire you. And you're going to move on with this big chip on your shoulder that says, I'm one of the few preachers in the brotherhood that's standing up for the truth. And everywhere I go, they just don't endure sound doctrine. Guys, it shouldn't be this way. It ought not be this way. Now, again, please hear me. I am not saying change the doctrine so that people accept it. But we can teach in a way that's loving. We can teach in a way that's kind. We can make the water sweet. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have to change it, and it doesn't mean that it's not going to step on their toes from time to time, and it doesn't mean that they're not going to realize the stark reality of their condition before God. But we can do it gently. And we need to. And too often we don't. Now, he's going to jump back into the concept of teachers specifically in verse 13. But before we go, the bell's going to ring in just 30 seconds. It says, who among you is wise and understanding? And we'll deal with those terms. But he says, let him show out of, this is another ek phrase, just like he was doing earlier. Let him show by his good behavior. Let him show out of his good behavior his deeds, what? In the gentleness of wisdom. You see, the wisdom that is from God is meek. It's gentle. This word here is the word that's often translated meek. Power under control. You know, when you're right, when you have God's wisdom, you don't have to yell and scream to win the battle. Guess what? You've got truth on your side. But you have to figure out a way to get them to see the truth, don't you? And so I don't feel the need to win the battle today, duking it out with Scott Pino. We're going to go to battle over baptism, and before I walk away, I'm going to win. Well, you may win the battle, but you may lose his soul. And so we need to demonstrate out of our good behavior our deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. Wisdom should allow us to teach with power, but gently, meekly, lovingly, patiently, knowing that God's word is what is going to stand and what is going to affect their hearts, not my ability to outshout them or to be the big shot in the classroom. The reality is I want you to walk out of this classroom with truth, knowing how it fits your life. Whether I want to show you that mirror that we looked at back in chapter 1, right? We need to look in the mirror. And if I'm going to be effective in showing you that mirror, I need to do it in the gentleness of wisdom, the meekness of wisdom, and allow you to see what God wants in your life. And if I do it harshly, if I do it out of selfish ambition or bitter jealousy, I'm not going to accomplish what I'm after. My motives are wrong. So we'll deal with verse 13 and keep going. Any questions about what we talked about today? Powerful section. Big illustrations throughout the section, but when you break down the illustrations, it's very cool what he's doing with this idea of learning to pilot the ship. We need to learn to control our tongue and steer our whole life and thusly the lives of others as well. Questions? Comments? All right. We'll be done.